Thank you. I'm Tom Hibbs. I'd like to welcome you to this session. Russell Hittinger, who holds the Warren Chair of Catholic Studies at Tulsa University. He has taught at the Catholic University of America, Princeton University, Fordham University, and New York University. He is on the editorial board of the American Journal of Jurisprudence and First Things. He has published two influential books, The Critique of the New Natural Law Theory and First Grace. He's also on the board of advisors of the Center for Ethics and Culture here. He is one of only two people in the world to hold two appointments to pontifical academies, one to the Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and the other to the Academy of the Social Sciences. Two comments that I would like to add. In my opinion, Russ is there are a lot of good people working on natural law today in the States, and I think that Russ is the best, and he's the best because he can range from detailed public policy debates to issues of constitutional law and jurisprudence to philosophical and theological writings of Thomas Aquinas and the entire Catholic tradition. He's also, here's something you may not know about Russ, that the story that will tell you something about him as a person and his intellect as well. We had him to Baylor a few years back. I think it was Hurricane Rita that was ripping through the state, and he was to come in on a Thursday and speak on a Friday, and he managed to fly in. I talked to him, I think, on Thursday morning and said, well, we could cancel this because perhaps by the time you get here, we will be completely inundated by this hurricane. And he said, no, I'm coming. And he arrived and then had to drive home because they had canceled all the flights going out. But he was, as he proudly told us when he arrived in Waco, he was the only person in Dallas going south. Everybody else was going north. And this made it all the more exciting for Russ, that he was flying right into the eye of the storm. And if you know anything about his intellectual work, that there's a fit there between Russ's work and his personality and his great love of debate and conversation. So join me in welcoming Russ Hittinger, who will speak to us today on the image of God and the common good.
Thank you. And there's some other people from Baylor who were at that talk I gave. They canceled classes, but my talk was completely packed. So it's pretty good for the Baylor students. Catholic social doctrine began in response to a new anthropological and political creed of man and citizen that swept from France to the rest of Europe and then to her former colonies. This creed considered the human person in two ways. First, as a natural datum, having liberties which had been obscured or broken by the historical social order. Second, the human person was considered as a citizen, standing equally among other citizens before the state. On this model, fraternity was associated preeminently, if not exclusively, with citizenship. For membership in the state is is how man is reconstituted from the fragments and broken relations of nature and history. Other social memberships claiming their origins in nature, history, or in divine revelation were deemed legitimate, only insofar as they were either the private choice of individuals or insofar as they were permitted or conceded by the state. Sort of like what China did 2 years ago. Administrative Order Number 5. The Chinese government declared. By the way, the subject of the measurement is management measures for the reincarnation of living Buddhas. And the Chinese government declared, the state prohibits Buddhist monks from returning from the dead without government permission. No one outside China can influence the reincarnation process, and only monasteries in China can apply for the concession. That's what the Catholic Church was facing in Europe after 1789. And Catholic thinkers, both clerical and lay, quickly targeted the ideal of fraternity as the most troubling part of the new creed. Famously, Cardinal Chiaramonte, who becomes Pius VII, who was put into captivity by Napoleon eventually. When he was cardinal, he put on his letterhead, "Liberty, equality, and peace in our Lord Jesus Christ." Throughout the 19th century, Catholic thinkers attempted to identify what Joseph de Maistre called the sacred perimeter, that is, social domains having a sacred solidarity not reducible to citizenship. And they defended, even before the French Revolution was over, they began a tactic of defending social orders higher and lower than the state. This tactic of defending higher and lower social orders was preeminently on display in Bishop Emanuel von Kettler's Advent sermons of 1848. But after 1860, when the Roman magisterium began to develop a serious body of social teachings, the popes followed Kettler's model. It took a scissors-like approach to the state, limiting and contextualizing citizenship according to higher and lower social orders. Second, the papal magisterium tended to sacralize these orders. How you deal with the modern state. You squeeze it from two directions. While adjustments in detail were made during the era of totalitarianism, the basic scissors-like approach has remained intact even to our day. Now, I'm not going to rehearse all the historical details of this tradition. Rather, I want to raise a question that emerges from within it. Simply put, do social entities exist unto the image and likeness of God? And even today, this is a disputed issue in Catholic theology, about which it's not easy to reach a clean and unambiguous verdict. For one thing, although the question first emerged in the context of social doctrine, it bestrides Christology, sacramental theology, ecclesiology, and theological anthropology. So my purpose this morning is not to resolve this problem, or at least not to resolve it in every respect. But I do want to mark some major moments in the evolution and disposition of the question. First, some brief definitions, or definitions briefly put. Within the Catholic tradition, imago, a copy, similitudo, a likeness or perfection of an image, imitatio, a representation, a simulatio, a kind of congruence of form, a conformatio, a constitutional character, and vestigium, a footprint or a trace, are all theological terms of art. Since Leo XIII, magisterial documents rely chiefly upon Thomas Aquinas' understanding of sacral imaging. Since the Second Vatican Council, however, the neo-scholastic tradition has a much looser grip over this subject. And while the scholastic terms are always the best place to begin, they do not necessarily indicate where the discussion ends. Even so, some things are commonly taught in the Catholic tradition. Imago pertains in an unqualified sense to Christ, who is the eternal and consubstantial image of the Father. In the case of the created human person, who is an imperfect likeness, the proper description is drawn from sacred scripture. Ad imaginem et similitudinem Dei, unto the image and likeness of God, not the image of God. The preposition indicates that the imprinted image in the human person is not one in being with its source. Thus, imago is in man only by an analogy of proportion. What is the proportion? The proportion signified by imago is not just any created effect, but a likeness in species or a likeness in nature. But nothing participates directly by way of species or nature in divinity except the divine persons themselves. In the human person, the participated likeness consists in acts of knowing and loving which are at the root of human nature. Traditionally, this has been called the image of representation. That is, a pattern of knowledge and love in the creature that manifests from afar a likeness of divinity. Minimally, it can be taken to mean the human capacity or aptitude for God as the first principle of being and goodness, and this is intimated in the creature's spiritual operations, which are both self-possessing and self-transcending. It is also commonly taught that although human reason, untutored by faith, can detect within itself and in other human persons something divine-like in the operations of knowledge and love, The notion that the created person is an analog of a trinity of divine persons can be grasped only by faith. As Augustine said, we see a trinity within ourselves, but we believe a trinity in the Godhead. Traditionally, this is called image of conformity, that is, by grace. By adoption, the human person is made a player or a communicant in a communion of divine persons, and we grasp not only the Trinitarian image that's there inchoately by nature and obscured by sin, we also glimpse something of the community of divine persons in Christ's members who exercise faith, hope, and charity. Finally, it's commonly taught that the term similitudo, or likeness, can mean two things. A likeness can be something more general than an image. All creatures have a certain likeness to God without being an image. But similitudo can also mean the perfection of an image. The likeness of the image is more perfect by acquisition or infusion of certain habits. The perfection, whether by nature or grace, is not merely in the capacities to know and love, but in the actions of doing that, in the perfection of those actions. So, as I understand how you situate this topic, and I'll get to the social bit in a moment, in Catholic theology, image falls directly under theological anthropology and Christology, while likeness, as the perfection of an image, falls under moral and sacramental theology, because both moral and sacramental theology pertain to actions perfecting the image. Chiefly, actions in conformity to grace, but not excluding perfections derived from action in accord with the natural law. At least in the Roman model, as it's practiced today, social doctrine attends to similitudo, that is, actions that perfect the image, whether personal or mystical. I'll explain that distinction later. Now, having compressed into a few paragraphs and several books of theology here, and having bulldozed over many other distinctions, I present to you the question, can image and likeness be predicated of a society? If we mean that the image and likeness consists directly and properly in an accumulation of social relations, the answer is clearly no. Augustine and Thomas reject, for example, the idea that Adam is not image until Eve, and that neither of them are images until the child. A sort of almost Mormon-like position that Augustine took after in the early 5th century. Even as recently the Second Vatican Council, what I'm calling the sociological notion of the Trinity, was raised on the council floor. And it was quickly rejected, simply on the authority of Augustine and Aquinas. Made unto the image of God, the human person is an intelligent being endowed with free will and self-movement. And this dignity is sacral, the council said, because the soul is directly created by and ordered to God. The primary relation, therefore, is not the sociological relation to someone else. It's the created image entirely to its entire Trinitarian exemplar. So said the Second Vatican Council, a very traditional teaching. Moreover, a human social order does not have a unity of substance, and therefore it would seem incapable of being imago in the strict sense of the term. If we are to speak of a social image, we need a real principle of unity. For where there is no unity, there is nothing to bear the image of the exemplary divine unity. What the scholastics called unity of aggregation, or composition, therefore is ruled out. Any kind of social order that's merely aggregate in character can't be the bearer of an image, has insufficient unity. But it leaves open the possibility that an image can be said of a non-substantial union possessing a unity that is something more than an aggregation. For example, the unity of persons participating the common good. Now, Leo and his successors, but especially Pius XI, were aware of the problem. How could you not be when you start to launch this project called social doctrine and you're defending social orders wherever you can find them other than the state? The question arises, how sacred are these things? And can we predicate image of it? Well, Leo and his successors fashioned a quasi-solution in two steps. First, they appropriated Aristotle's understanding of the social unity of order. and grafted it on the Pseudo-Dionysius formula that the good is self-diffusive, bonum sui diffusivum est. This step by the way, this is the original work of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, was to work out these grafting jobs. This step provided a general, natural law framework for understanding the sacred iconicity of social orders, at least insofar as the individual image acquires the perfection of similitude by being rightly ordered in the social body. Second, Leo and his successors turned to sacramental theology in order to show how some social orders, and I won't leave you guessing, church and sacramental marriage, are directly and properly called images. Okay, so let's go through these steps. A unity of order stands between a unity of substance, a man, a bird, a plant, on the one hand, and a unity of mere aggregation on the other, a heap of sand or a queue waiting for the tram. In a social unity of order, a marriage, a family, a college, a church, each individual retains his own identity and operations, yet the social whole is more than the sum of its parts. It counts as an object, a person, an agent in its own right. It has a unity based not in rational substance, but in rational order. Lawyers and philosophers called this kind of entity a moral person, or a legal person, or even a mystical body. JP2 called them interpersonal subjectivities. These and other such terms designate a unity of members in a non-substantial body. A social entity has not only a common end, but an intrinsic common good. Aquinas calls it communicatio in forma, that is, a shared form that marks its distinctive kind of union and its common action. Form of order distinguishes a society from other kinds of human intersubjectivity. A crowd at a shopping mall or an audience at the opera exhibit intersubjectivity without pursuing a common end through united action. Partners, for example, pool their resources for the purpose of increasing profit. But such pooling does not necessarily require common action, and its proximate end is a private yield cashed out to each partner rather than an enjoyment of an indivisible common good. Now, whenever the social magisterium uses the phrase true society, which actually is used quite a bit over the past 150 years, what is a true society? A true society means two or more persons communicating in a common good that cannot be distributed or cashed out. The common good never exists as a private good, and therefore when someone exits a marriage or a polity or a church, he cannot take away his private share. Even in our debased era of jurisprudence, courts understand perfectly well that they can divide and distribute the external properties, but not the marriage itself. They can't send the former husband away with 38% of the marriage. It will send him away with only 10% of the money. But anyway. Why? Because marriage is a common good. It is not distributable in the quantitative sense of the term. And whatever is not distributable, according to quantity, possesses some real unity, even if it's not substance. In the case of divorce, therefore, the matrimonial society is not redistributed so much as dissolved or annulled. You either have an indivisible common good or you don't have it at all. And there's only one way to have it, to participate it. It can't be divided. So, take for example the queue in front of the credit union. The individuals are the parts of the queue. They're partners in the credit union, but they're the members of St. Rita's Parish. To be sure, human persons related as parts and partners exhibit sociability and intersubjectivity. But it is only in their relations as members that it's possible to speak of a society. A social union, JP2 insisted, is something more than a relation alter apud alteram, a side-by-side intersubjectivity. A social union will always enjoy a common good that is intrinsically valuable to each of its members. So, Leo XIII and his successors took this Aristotelian rubric of the social unity of order and grafted it onto Pseudo-Dionysius, which is to say, they did what Thomas Aquinas did. Dionysius held that creatures imitate God in a twofold manner, and here comes the social part. First, insofar as each creature has its own perfection in the order of substance, Second, insofar as creatures cause good in others, thus the famous dictum, bonum sui diffusivum est, the good is diffusive of itself. The greater the good, the more communicable and shareable. So, Leo and his student, Ratti, future Pius XI, were quite keen on this formula. Both of them used it frequently to explain the sacred dignity of social orders. Here, one example will suffice. In the first year of his pontificate, Leo issued a letter on the problem of socialism, Quod Apostolici Muneris. On the issue of whether diversity and inequality have a social purpose, Leo writes, "For he who created and governs all things has in his wise providence appointed that the things which are lowest should attain their ends through those which are intermediate, and those again by the highest. Thus, even in the kingdom of heaven, he has willed that the choirs of angels be distinct and some subject to others, and also in the church has instituted various orders and diversity of offices, so that all are not apostles, or doctors, or pastors. So also has he appointed that there should be various orders in civil society, differing in dignity, rights, and power, whereby the state, like the church, should be one body, consisting of many members, some nobler than others, but all necessary to each other and solicitous for their common good." Unquote. Now, Leo here is directly paraphrasing Aquinas. And here's what Thomas wrote in his work on the sentences. "God wished to produce his works in likeness to himself, as far as possible, in order that they might be perfect and that he might be known through them. Hence, that he might be represented in his works, not only according to what he is in himself, but also according as he acts on others. He laid this natural law on all things, that last things should be reduced and perfected by middle things, and middle things by the first, as Dionysius says. So, what exists in God is communicated to creatures in a multiform manner, thus a double imitation or portrayal. First, a diversity of created things, each having a good according to its participated being. Second, a diversity of created things imitating God insofar as they cause good in others. In effect, insofar as they bring into existence, through secondary causality, additional modes of participation among themselves and others. The superabundance of what exists in God simply is in creation most perfectly expressed in a very manifold. Charity perfects a social principle embedded in the creation of angels and men, namely that one loves the good, not only as it is possessed or owned, but even more, you love the good as it abides, as it is poured forth and communicated to many. Thus, according to the exhortation of Ephesians 5, be ye imitators of God, the intellective creature loves the good precisely insofar as it's communicated to many, as it's made common. And without a unity of order, we would only have isolated individual things, each having the good of its own being, but all together portraying nothing more than a quantitative accumulation. And therefore, against socialism and liberalism, Leo insisted that the natural law requires the preservation of both the individual good and the pouring forth of the good in social relations. As Charles Ciconnet pointed out in the 1940s, one cannot love the common good without loving its shareability with others. The fallen angels did not refuse the perfection of that good that was offered to them. They refused its community. And for his part, Thomas Aquinas argued that one cannot become a citizen, either in a temporal or a celestial society, without a special virtue pertaining to the good precisely as poured out and shared. Thus the two master virtues, general justice, or legal justice, and charity, both of which pertain to what is common and indivisible. This double imitation can also be considered in the light of the Trinity. In the Trinity, a community of persons communicate in common form. As the ancient creed puts it, persons are consubstantial. And according to Revelation, this is a sui generis case of relations which are not accidental but substantial. In the creature, however, communication in a substantial form would obliterate the individuals and remove the ability to cause good in others. Therefore, creaturely imitation of God exhibits two forms, which cannot be confused or absolutely separated. Each form represents something of a Trinitarian unity. The creature possesses, imperfectly and from afar, likeness of image in the order of substantial form, the unity of the soul's spiritual operations, as well as an additional perfection or similitude insofar as he or she communicates with others through a social form. Thus, two different but correlative ideas of unity and good. And as Thomas said, the creature is like God in unity, inasmuch as each creature is one in itself, and all together are one by unity of order. So, what would be missing from the world if the state reduced all dignities to individuals and all individuals to a single homogeneous social form of citizenship? Leo contended, it was an audacious contention. I mean, imagine writing your first encyclical in 1878, citing Dionysius on angelic choirs. But Leo contended it would be like angels without choirs. That is, isolated entities which individually in the order of substance bear divine image, but lack a diversity communicating in a social form whereby gifts are given and received. Society, said Leo in Rerum Novarum, cannot be reduced to one dead level. Indeed, it was audacious in 1878. Not only to pull out Dionysius' treatise on angelic hierarchy out of the hat to respond to the socialists. Even more general, Leo and his successors were advancing an argument for normative pluralism based on social imitation of God. Recall that in Genesis, the individual acts of creation are deemed good, one by one, but the hexameral acts are crowned, very good, with the relation of Adam and Eve. The order is deemed very good. Something new is brought into existence. Not another substance, but a unity of order whereby persons, through action, cause good in one another. And this diffusion of the good in human persons from the beginning is marked by a social union, which is itself a type of the church, as Augustine said, all creations for the sake of the church. Now, when Leo and Pius XI speak this way, sometimes they use the word imago of this new relation, but more often they use the term similitudo. Recall, similitudo can mean the perfection of an image. The human person is made unto the image and likeness of God, first as regards the soul and its operations, but second, sub specie societatis. In short, social unions are the perfection of the image. And therefore, by suppressing or homogenizing social relationships other than citizenship, the modern state was at war with the sacred order of things. Insofar as the state permitted the existence of other social entities only by concession, and in the pattern of state sovereignty, the state was implicitly claiming to be the exemplary cause of the good. Social entities are in effect icons or copies of the state. We should not underestimate how widely and deeply Catholic thinkers in 1789 depicted the modern state as a neo-pagan expression of state sovereignty. As for liberalism, the social magisterium typically complained that the second prong of the Dionysian formula is either denied or obscured. Diffusion of the good for liberalism is only an aggregate result ensuing upon self-interested action, the hidden hand of the market. We might think of Hayek's notion of catalexy, a spontaneous order in which good is diffused all right without anyone intending to do so. This model preserves perhaps the dignity of the individual, but does not affirm, at the least, the perfection of the image. So if the total state is the demonic rival to the divinity, the liberal state is the demonic rival to the diffusion of the good via social relations, which represent, however inchoately, the divine Trinity. Now, I want to say a few things about the transition from this general pattern of imitating God, sub specie societatis, to a more specific one, in specie sacramenti, that is, with respect to the sacramental image. Leo's Arcanum Divina, 1880, followed the next generation by Pius XI's Casti Connubii, 1930, were the two most important teachings on marriage since the Council of Trent. Leo and Pius contended, or they were wrestling with, state laws on civil marriage and divorce, which were driven by the proposition that by nature marriage is only a collaboration for the purpose of reproduction. Matrimony, therefore, has no fixed or what Leo would call insculpted form. Therefore, the form of unions, man and woman, having no fixed or insculpted form, the form of union is entirely the creature of the state's law, either by way of a direct imposition, the marriage law, or by way of what that law allows the individuals to impose upon themselves. It is not difficult to appreciate why the social form of matrimony was of chief interest to Catholics. For without an insculpted form, a social form, marriage cannot be the natural sign of the union of Christ with his church. Remember, only marriage of the seven sacraments has as its natural sign a society. So, citing Thomas, Pius XI contends that marriage is not merely a consent to the joining of bodies with a reproductive end in view. Rather, marriage is a consent to a certain union upon which ensue the ends. Marriage is not a free-floating set of ends or purposes, but ends brought about through a specific mode of union. As Thomas taught, nor is the direct object of consent a husband, but union with a husband on the part of the wife, even as it is the union with a wife on the part of the husband. Psychologically, of course, one desires or chooses this man or woman, and it could also be true that one has in view a mutually agreeable end, such as reproduction or economic security for the group. But its consent to the union, participation in the societal form, deserves to be called marriage. Other intentions, to consent to this man or this woman, or to consent to a common end, can obtain in the absence of matrimony. Indeed, partnerships of various kinds, including partnerships which create a common pool of resources, will often entail consensus, this person rather than that person, for such and such an end without implying consent to a societal union. So Pius XI, working these Thomistic texts, writes that while begetting and education of children are first in the order of ends, they are not first in the form that makes the matrimony. Quote, this mutual molding, interior conformatio, of husband and wife, this determined effort to perfect each other, can, in a really very real sense, as the Roman Catechism teaches, be said to be the chief reason and purpose of matrimony, provided matrimony be looked at not in the restricted sense, as an institution for the proper conception and education of the child, but more widely as the blending of life as a whole and the mutual interchange and sharing thereof, unquote. He argues that marriage depends upon a generous surrender of his own person made to another. So all the self-giving stuff people associate with JP2, it's in Casti Connubii, actually. It gets to JP2 by some documents of Vatican II. Because the social form is instituted by God, Pius asserts that marriage is more sacred than the state. So we've got one thing lower than the state that's more sacred than the state. Yeah, it's more sacred for another reason. Matrimony is the natural fundament of the sacrament. By grace, the social union, Pius writes, has to be called imago Christi. Pius calls it a living image, an efficacious and mystical image of the whole Christ had in members. Importantly, Pius insists that husband and wife bear the image by reciprocation. It has to be done together. At least under the sacrament, neither the husband nor the wife alone are the image, but the union itself. For the sacrament, methodological individualism just won't work. Namely, the social entities and relations among members can be reduced to non-social properties of members or composites thereof. It won't work for the sacrament of marriage. It may work for civil marriage, but not for the sacrament. So here we have at least one instance of a social entity that's not just the perfection of an individual image, but is itself the bearer of an image, sacramental marriage. If we apply the three aspects of the Eucharist to marriage, what do we get? Sacramentum tantum, the sign alone. The sign alone is a social union of a man and a woman. The sacramentum et res, the sign together with the internal reality, another social entity, union of Christ and the Church. And the res tantum, the thing itself, which is communion in a social order called matrimony. So, we should not be surprised that Catholic social doctrine so regularly and consistently turned to the problem of matrimony. It's not in the first place a problem of moral theology. Once upon a time, Catholic thinkers were perfectly able to investigate the institutional and metaphysical nature of something without worrying about without worrying about ethics. Right. In Leo's time, it was the institution that had to be understood. This is the original case of a social union bearing the dignity of an imago Christi. And not just any sacral image, but the most theologically plutonium-grade sacramental image, the image of Christ, the whole Christ, who does not only incorporate human nature, body and soul, but who also concorporates, which is to say, he founds a social body, and this is the Christus totus. We have, in short, an image derived not just from afar in the procession of the divine persons, but one more immediately in the mission of the incarnate second person, a new and distinct ground for affirming unto the image and likeness. Even so, this depends upon the integrity of the natural sign, which is marriage itself. This is why legal, political, and philosophical conflict between the modern state and the church over marriage and divorce is intimately related both to social doctrine and sacramental theology. Sacramental marriage for 200 years has been the test case for things that are higher and lower than the state. And we're not out of those woods at all. Okay, two things are in place. Now, I'm going to spin the reel faster. By the 1940s, the popes have put in two things. According to the Dionysian principle, individual rational creatures are made unto the image of God and exhibit a perfection of that image insofar as they're members of various social orders. Even on a generic natural understanding of the human person as image, the one that's even naive about Trinitarian exemplar, the person imitates God by causing good in others. This is a perfection, similitudo, of the created image. The image does not consist in the relations with others, but if the relations were removed or subverted, the image would be something less than itself at the operational level. Nothing can be called good without qualification unless it possesses all its requisite accidents. And in this case, in social relations, accidents of relation and habit. Okay. Marriage, however, is a social unity that not only fits the Dionysian formula, but enjoys a special status, although it is in one sense lower than the state. In another sense, it is, as Pius asserted, more sacred than the state. For its social form is not only directly instituted by God, but is also the natural sign of Christ's social body. Here the form is called imago. The conformatio of spouses is a sign of Christ whose incarnation was not merely incorporatio, but concorporatio, the establishment by grace of a social body. And it's called, properly and not metaphorically, imago Christi. So these two steps, having been taken roughly between 1878 and 1848, we can move right along to Vatican II. In the opening pages of Lumen Gentium, the Church's constitution on the Church, here we read right away that the Church is called a sacrament. In fact, the idea that the Church is a sacramental image is presented so quickly that one might think that it's either a pure assertion or that an argument had already been made for it. Well, an argument had already been made. It was made in Pius XII's Mystici Corporis, 1943. In the middle of World War II, Pius set out to explain why the primary mission of the Church is to be Christ's social body, and thereby to be a sign of the unity of the human race. In Mystici, Pius gives a rather thorough, he was a lawyer, he gives a rather thorough survey of the different ways that a social unity transcends the sum of its parts without destruction of its individual members. And the Church, he notes, is like other societies in this regard. It is a unity of order that does not destroy its individual members. It enjoys an intrinsic common good, functional organicity, etc. But, unlike other societies, the mystical body of Christ has no identity other than being Christ's social body. See, in the case of marriage, we can speak of the natural form that achieves a higher unity by the habilitation of grace. Marriage is marriage if it's not sacramentalized. But for its part, the Church has no identity, other than being grafted onto and conformed to its head. It has no form, other than the actions of its members through the outpouring of charity, the ordering of the Holy Spirit, and sacramental action. Were the Church only a social and juridical unity, it would be a social entity of some sort, maybe a formerly Catholic university or something. But it would not be the Church, even if it continues to show up in the Yellow Pages. Pius writes that by sanctifying grace we are conformed to the image of the Son of God, and renewed according to the image of him who creates us. But he goes on to argue, it is the will of Jesus Christ that the whole body of the church, no less than its individual members, should resemble him. Precisely as a society, the church is Christ's social body, expressing, Pius writes, both exterior and interior, the most faithful image of Christ. Citing Bellarmine and Gregory of Nyssa, Pius insists that the church is a person. And who is that person? The person is Christ. It's the whole Christ, head and social body. So the surprising thing is Vatican II was not Lumen Gentium, which just completed what Pius had done in this encyclical in 1943, Social Imago Christi. Rather, the surprising issue was tucked inside of Gaudium et Spes, where the Council treats the natural dignity of the individual as image of God. Early drafts of Gaudium et Spes had emphasized Genesis 1:17, male and female, he created them. Some bishops wanted to say that the social relation between Adam and Eve is, by creation, and not just by grace, a fundamental aspect of the imago. Because in Genesis 1, the only thing called imago, not the animals, were angels, only living and breathing human beings, male and female. It seems like a good place to begin right there. If you want a social imago, is to start with Genesis 1:17. But other bishops complained that this was going to reintroduce what I call the heresy of the sociological trinity, that is, people would only be imago by virtue of their relation to others, to other human beings. This would stumble in the heresy. It would hold that the imago is assembled through social relationships. It would derogate and mislead from the dignity of the individual, so under attack in modern times. And we have to remember, when they're drafting Gaudium et Spes, the totalitarian regimes are still in place. So the bishops compromised, and here's what came out in Gaudium et Spes 24, in its final form. Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prayed to the Father, that all may be one as we are one, opened up vistas closed to human reason, for he implied a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the unity of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness, the word is similitudo, reveals that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, cannot fully find himself except through the sincere gift of himself. Now, what the bishops did, they left out male and female who created them. They took from Casti Connubii, Pius XI's description of the matrimonial society as a mutual gift, and spliced it together with Christ's prayer for the church in John 17, in the order of grace. So interestingly, rather than dealing straight on with the question of the natural condition of the imago in the order of creation, male and female, they quote authoritative texts which pertain to how, in the order of grace, matrimony and church are imagines Christi. The social aspect of the image of God seems to be drawn entirely from New Covenant, without the natural fundament drawn from Genesis, which is, of course, presupposed by Ephesians 5 as the great sacramentum. Leaving out Genesis and moving directly to John 17, something seemed to be missing in Gaudium et Spes 24. It seems that the social aspect of the image of God is constituted entirely by grace, which is not quite right, even on Ephesians 5. So, on his election in 1978, John Paul made a beeline for Gaudium et Spes 24. He understood exactly what had happened, that they had left out the most obvious starting point. Male and female had created them. So, I quote, these are in his famous conferences right after his election. The Second Vatican Council, in speaking of the likeness of God, uses extremely significant terms. It refers not only to the divine image and likeness which every human being as such already possesses, but also and primarily, verum etiam et praesertum, to a certain similarity between the union of the divine persons and the union of God's children in truth and love. Unquote. The Gaudium et Spes did not say primarily. The Council was trying to say something like also. So JP2 is upgrading. He's upgrading Gaudium et Spes 24. For John Paul, the issue of the primarily and the also has to be relocated back in Genesis. That is, to the very passages that Gaudium et Spes 24 sidestepped. The Pope, I'm sure all of you know this by now, so I won't linger on it, but he argues that Adam's solitude mythically represented in Genesis 2, confirms the notion that the individual person is the bearer of a divine-like dignity. Everything in the solitude, the Pope says, must be affirmed as that which constitutes man. In Genesis, of course, Adamic solitude is resolved by God, who puts him into a sleep from which the original Adam awakes, male and female, as it were, and not quite a shotgun marriage, because Adam gives his consent. Adam's solitude is addressed not by assimilation to another natural substance, nor by the creation of a new substance, but by a communio personarum, a sexually differentiated community of persons. What's important for our purposes is the Pope's conclusion. In one of these conferences, I quote, "If we wish to draw also from the narrative of the Yahweh's text the concept of image of God, we can then deduce that man became image and likeness of God not only through his humanity, but also through the communion of persons which man and woman form right from the beginning. The function of the image is to reflect the one who is the model, to reproduce its own prototype. Man becomes the image of God, not so much in the moment of solitude as in the moment of communion." Unquote. Now, that's a problematic statement, it seems to me. It's led to a lot of speculation. But maybe we can understand what the Pope was saying just by deepening that Dionysian formula of a double imitation. So on this line of interpretation, which I rather like because it does the least damage to the tradition and allows for whatever novelties were being introduced, on this line of interpretation, we can say that first there is the individual created image in Genesis 1, male and female, in Genesis 2, Adam and then Eve. Second, we can say that there is a union of the two. Even before the question of diffusing the good through procreative action, Adam recognizes the good of the union. And Adam said, "Now this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Wherefore man shall leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be two in one flesh." By the way, in his commentary on this, Jerome says when Paul in Ephesians 5 is talking about the great mystery, the sacramentum, of Christ in the church, and he's referring back to this text in Genesis, Jerome, ever the good monk, said, and what he was thinking of primarily is leaving mother and father. That's the great mystery, because Christ leaves the divine kingdom and becomes man and forms the social body of the church. So, these sexually differentiated persons complete one another. This agrees in its essentials with the Dionysian picture, or at least the jazzed up version of it. The individual is perfected as a member in union with others by performing acts of giving and receiving. Hence, both the image and its similitude, its perfection. In fact, John Paul II elsewhere frequently refers to the Dionysian principle in terms of what he calls the double subjectivity of the imago. The human creature, he says, images the Trinity in his own subjectivity and as a member of a social subjectivity. It's in the nature of the image to diffuse the good through reciprocity of the gift. From the beginning, therefore, the Pope argues, marriage is proto-sacramental. Now we do have a creeping sacramentalization. You see, we not only have sacramental marriage as image, and church as sacramental image, we now have natural law matrimony as proto-sacramental. This has caused all kinds of troubles for the canonical courts in Rome. They deserve it, too. But on the other hand, it does seem that the Pope asserts a relational ontology of the created imago that Gaudium et Spes 24 hesitated to affirm. Moreover, developments in ecclesiology, from Mystici Corporis through Lumen Christi, and in sacramental theology, especially in marriage cases, have clearly insisted that the church and the sacramental image should be called images of Christ. But this was the disputed issue. So, the International Theological Commission, for 2 years, studied the disputed issue, and in 2003 submitted to Cardinal Ratzinger, President of the Commission, a document entitled Communion and Stewardship, Human Persons Created in the Image of God. Referring to Genesis 1:27, the Commission states, God placed the first human beings in relation to one another, each with a partner of the other sex. According to this conception, man is not an isolated individual, but a person, an essentially relational being. The fundamentally relational character of the Imago Dei constitutes its ontological structure. Unquote. The relational nature, the Commission says, belongs to the specific manner in which the Imago Dei exists. The Commission rejects any kind of dualism that would vest the image only in the psychological capacities, in exclusion to the human body, and it denied any sort of monism that would vest the image only in the actualization of the individual. The Commission, therefore, seems to affirm the stronger interpretation, the Trinitarian and relational structure of the created Imago. It concludes, this is the Commission, the created image affirmed by the Old Testament is, according to the New Testament, to be completed in the Imago Christi. The New Testament development of this theme, two distinct elements emerge: the Christological and the Trinitarian character of the Imago Dei, and the role of sacramental mediation in the formation of the Imago Christi, unquote. So the Commission takes marriage as the chief instance of both the natural and supernaturally elevated situation of the Imago. Social doctrine now is always circling back to Genesis, to this original unity. And marriage is, after all these decades and centuries, still the foundational example for both the natural and supernatural principles of man being made under the image and likeness of God. This is where the issue stands today, as I can conclude very quickly. There are two social bodies which, without doubt, this is not a disputed issue, two social bodies deserve the predicate Imago: sacramental marriage and church. In the order of grace, they are called Imago Christi precisely as a social union. Both are higher and more sacred than the state. But it looks like natural marriage, as proto-sacramental, is getting close to being called Imago. That's not been resolved. As this line of thought has developed over the course of the last century, the magisterium just circles back over and over again, considering the individual Imago as it exists by nature. So in his conferences on Genesis, John Paul II concedes that unlike Genesis 1, Genesis 2 does not speak of the image of God. What then is added to our notion of image by Genesis 2? And John Paul II says two things: the image as communion of persons, and, from the beginning, man is an image of an inscrutable divine communion of persons. Pope Benedict's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, moves directly to this language about the proto-sacramental nature of the image in the union of Adam and Eve. And Benedict concludes the Catholic understanding of social order is marked chiefly by sacramental mysticism. Shouldn't be surprised at all by that, because sacramental image has been used forcefully now to squeeze the state from two directions. From the beginning, it's a relational Imago, and by grace, Imago Christi. And Benedict contends that this latter feature, quote, is not simply a matter of morality, something that could exist apart from and alongside Christ in its sacramental reactualization. In other words, what the Church primarily has to offer the world in social doctrine is Imago Christi. It's the notion of a social order that's made unto the image and likeness of that which is the image, which is Christ, through his social body. In other words, social doctrine is primarily ecclesiology and sacramental theology. Granted, there's some policy things you have to do in social doctrine as well. Okay. I'm going to stop. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop there because I think that's where the issue stands today. It's still moving. It's still moving. But to summarize, we can speak of a society, if it's a true society, not an aggregation, as a perfection of an image. That's completely settled. That's the Dionysian. It's the perfection of an image by the causing of good in others, but not image itself. But two societies can be called image, and that's sacramental marriage and church. Natural law marriage is right behind. It's like not a caboose back there anymore either. I mean, it's making a move. It hasn't happened yet, though. There's still hesitations to take that one more step. Thank you.
Okay, any questions?
Sure.
Please.
Grattan, sorry.
Thanks, Russ, for a terrific paper. What are the strengths and weaknesses of using the church's teaching on baptism to work out the problem of the sacramentality and natural aspects of marriage as an image of God?
It took me a long time to figure out why Second Vatican Council started using these terms that sounded awfully sociological to me. Having grown up in the old church, sacraments of initiation, right, and people's gods. I know now. It took me the better part of 40 years thinking about to understand what Vatican II was trying to do. It was trying to make good on Mystici Corporis. Now remember, in Mystici Corporis, written in the middle of World War II, Pius XII tells the reader why he's writing the thing. A, the primary mission of the church is not to have teachings about war and not to tell people not to murder each other and stuff like that. The church does that too. It's sort of public service. But the primary purpose of the church, it's founded to be Christ's social body and to be the living sign in time of the incorporation of the entire, or concorporation of the entire human race. So, he says, the problem then is that we have overly juridicalized ecclesiology. By the way, Pius XII was a juridical guy, as it were. But he recognized the church is not just to be described in the legal language of having its sovereignty, its internal common good, moral personhood, and so on and so forth. That is, the church is something more than that. The church is Christ. It's his social body. And therefore, we need more social language to describe this, not just legal language. That's not to say legal language is not social language. Right? That was what they were trying to make good on at Vatican II, by redescribing sacraments in more social terms. I find this to be natural, organic evolution of Catholic doctrine since the French Revolution. And so I think we should look at all the sacraments according to that wonderful division of, the sign itself, the sign and its reality, and the reality itself. And for any sacrament, the reality itself is called communion. It's social. And we should think this way. The problem is that after Vatican II, I'm going off on a tangent here, so I'll try to recall myself back to your question. The problem after Vatican II is that too many people made it merely sociological. And they downgraded the mystery of this thing, and the metaphysics, and who knows what happened to Pseudo-Dionysius along the way. Right? That's what happened, but the original impulse was good. It was a legitimate impulse to understand ourselves as Catholics in a social order, just both higher and lower than the state, and to talk about sacraments of initiation, et cetera, et cetera. It was right to stress the communion of the communicants at the Eucharist. That's Christ's social body. It's not the soup kitchen first. You see, but that got lost along the way. And I think that's why you will see John Paul II and Ratzinger, Papa Benedict. You'll see all the time they say, not merely sociological. You see that phrase cropping up all the time. And that's what they mean. That this more adequate social doctrine, right, was being frittered away in the post-conciliar years by putting it in shallow sociological terms. In fact, I think Benedict uses the term twice in the latest encyclical, not merely sociological. Yes, there was a question over here.
Well, one of my takeaways from your talk is that with the church being brought into contemporary debate over marriage, on the terms set by the civil definition of marriage as a contracted entity of two individuals, they've already lost. Is that a correct takeaway from your talk? So they have to frame their response to challenges to marriage on the terms set by a liberal definition of marriage.
Yeah, the church has never accepted that. So the church is being very obstinate because it's not only not accepting the secular Caesar's definition of marriage. It's upgrading its own definition of marriage, right? I mean, that's called, in various languages, FU, is what the church is saying. Now, but if you go back, though, to the first important tract written on this in modern times, it's Joseph Bonal's book on divorce. Because when they were drafting the Napoleonic Code, they didn't know what to do with divorce because the French Revolution made the first unilateral no-fault divorce law. It was during the French Revolution. And Napoleon didn't know whether to put this in his code. He had doubts. I mean, this is the good side of Napoleon. He wanted to leave a code for the ages, and he didn't want to mess it up with divorce. Okay. So a draft of the divorce part of it got into the hands of Joseph Bonal, who wrote a critique of divorce. Almost everything the Catholic Church has taught since then is just footnote to Bonal's thing. He says, we have three options. By the way, he won. Napoleon kept it out. It was only the Third Republic that brought it back in at the time of Leo. That's why Arcanum was necessary, against what the Third Republic had done. But there's three options.
Speak up a little bit.
The three options are sexual union with an intention not to form a union, a society. That's just promiscuity. Or sexual union with no intention to form a society, and that's concubinage. Number three, sexual union with an intention to form a society, and that's called marriage. Go right back to Thomas. The consent of the matrimonial thing, just the consent to the union, not just to the man or the woman. So, listen, they knew in 1800, when that book was published by Bonal, still in print, they knew that they were really up against it. And that almost everything in the revolution, once again, I go back to the beginning of my paper, the problem of fraternity was going to be played out on what you think of church and marriage. Things are not much better today. What can we say? They were right. Bonal was right. Leo was right on this stuff. We should never get lulled into the notion that the modern concept of fraternity is inert and it's all going to go away. Yes. Bill Frank.
What kind of unions can and cannot serve as imagos, images? These unions of order. I mean, you gave marriage as one and church as another, and it's a very, seems to me, a very rich development of, social metaphysics, really.
Yeah.
But what kind of constraints on it? I mean, what does it include? Friendships? Does it include baseball teams? I mean,
it's a good question.
What can and cannot serve as one of these social unions?
To my knowledge, the outer boundary has been established that imago, not just perfection of an imago, but imago is for grace, and it's imago Christi. And I don't see in any of the major players, pontifical or otherwise, any effort right now to start talking about clubs and that kind of thing. But clubs are similitudo, it's similitudines, perfections of the image. I was once on, maybe some of you have been there, but I'm sure you have, Bill. If you go out to where San Agnese fuori le Mura is, out to that catacomb, it's about 3 mileposts out from the original gates. And it was siesta time, so I was waiting for them to open it back up. And I saw these old people in the cutest uniforms, almost like school kids. There's about 25 or 30 of them. And I asked this friend I was with, what's that? He said, that's one of Pius XI's bowling teams. That in order to counteract the fascists, they built all these clubs, right? And they were a bowling team. They're all about 75 years old, and these little outfits. So that's cute, but I don't think we're going to call that imago Christi. At least not yet. But it is a good question, because the closer a social entity, if it's a true social entity, stands to the inside of the church, the closer it's getting. So, for instance, a pontifical university faculty, it's getting into being something that can speak in persona membrorum, to use Augustine's language. Jesus is words from the cross. He speaks for his members from the cross. And to be able to speak in persona membrorum is to be able to speak in the name of the church. It's to have something of that identity, you see. Canon law has a whole list of criteria for how you move from just being a club approved by the church to being something that can speak in persona membrorum. But the closer, I'm just pointing out, as you get to that, the closer you're getting to the imago, the deeper kind of participation in it than a mere club. I guess these things will be tested. Let's just hope it doesn't include blogging and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, which would just trivialize the thing again. Yes, sir.
And wouldn't the idea of like the lane movement
Yeah.
as a kind of entering closer into this idea of imago, though they're not,
Right.
I mean, they're expressions of the church.
That's right.
They are interior to it. They're a structure that, in a sense, provides a place for communion,
That's right.
you know, as a kind of new development.
There is a lot of uncharted territory right now on this. And I have to say, I got a little nervous in reading the encyclical this summer when I saw the theology of the body bringing out their economic corporations. Because, well, maybe that could be true. But, you see, as you can see from my paper, I'm trying to keep the thing limited to some extent. I don't want to see it hemorrhage in every direction. It gets out of control. But theology of the body, reciprocity, gift, union, all these fundamental things, communion. Well, we should be sparing in what we attribute these things to. But I don't think anyone has a formula. No one has a plan for this. And all of the movements inside the church are all testing this in different ways, right? And it's certainly not just clerical anymore. That's the big change, right? Pius XI's bowling teams, right, don't hold a candle to the kind of sophistication of organization in society as the movements to them. So we'll see.
Take two more questions.
Yes.
I'm not sure that I was able to follow one thing when you were discussing John Paul II's Wednesday addresses about the interpretation of the first two chapters of Genesis. I thought that you were saying at one point that JP2 was saying that Adam isn't fully the image of God until Eve is created.
It looks that way, doesn't it?
I also thought from later in your notes that you disagreed with that. I don't know if you'd be willing to say more.
Well, because I like new things to be old. So if you can convince me that there's a way to speak of Adam not as image until Eve and avoid the sociological trinity heresy, then I'm game. But I would never attribute to the Holy Father the sociological trinity heresy, even on a Wednesday afternoon. Stuff like that. And so, therefore, I'm not being cute. My method is to interpret it as straightly as I can in accordance with tradition. And that you can interpret that comment as conforming to the Dionysian formula. Man is not just good in imitation of God as human substance, the rational animal. That for sure. But also good in communion with others. And if you're not in communion with others, rightly ordered, this is a defacing of the way creation is to imitate God. And so, if you want to put it, he's not so much image just at the moment of his solitude, but in communion. I can incorporate that into the Dionysian formula without any damage to what the Pope has said. If, however, he's saying, not yet, Adam's not yet. But, by the way, I think there are other passages that make it clear that he's not going that far.
Last question.
Yes, sir.
As I understood, toward the end of your talk, you talk about marriage even kind of naturally considered as an image of Christ. And John Paul, in his discussion, talked about kind of twofold order of marriage. Originally, marriage as the sacrament of creation, marriage as the primordial sacrament, in which the love of God the Creator is imaged. And then he talked about the subsequent marriage as the sacrament of redemption. It seems like, can we say then that marriage as the primordial sacrament, the sacrament of creation, is properly an image of Christ? That is, the marriage of the original couple, or two could take it from however you want to say.
It's a great question. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not sure how we should answer this. And I think the reason we're asking the question is because we're standing on 2 millennia of Christian theology and hasn't been sure how to answer this. I mean, there's been a lot of opinions about this matter. But if we follow Augustine, and I think Aquinas pretty much follows Augustine in saying that the hexameron is to be interpreted theologically, that everything is made for the sake of the church, and that the unity of our first parents, which was the true social unity, is a type. From the very beginning was a type. They didn't know it. Maybe they didn't know it. And maybe this was lost sight of one, but it was from all eternity intended to be the type, the church. And that's why when you go to 15, you notice that the central panel in the ceiling is not the creation of Adam. It's the creation of Eve. The central panel is Eve, not Adam. And the one with Adam and God's flying across the ceiling, right, with the finger, he has something in his arms, God the Father. It's the church. And Eve is being brought out of Adam. It's Christ in the church. It always was that way. Now, there's really significant theological opinions that will favor an upgraded proto-sacramental notion of natural law marriage. There's a lot. But there are dangers in it, too. And, got to be very clear how we align this. But I do know with JP, too, that toward the end of his pontificate, you can read these, by the way, because they're collected together, his statements to the Roman Rota, his annual statements, and they were really admonitory, to put it mildly. He's saying, I don't want you annulling natural law marriages. Don't drag me into this. And I don't want to hear about Petrine and Pauline privileges either. Because his intuition was, if I'm correct, that by making the dignity of marriage depend so much on the sacrament, they were losing sight of the natural sign and its place within the economy of revelation and providence. Did he win against the Roman Rota? You never win against the Roman Rota. Right? It's like the Third Republic in France. But he admonished him, and I think he's continually bringing that problem into view. So I go back. It's a good question because a lot of people have been asking this question. Just how to get the right balance and emphasis on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good.